Friends, a very warm welcome to you. My duty to say a few words about the Institute. I say that before every lecture, just to say how it was started and what we've done so far. So, the Parekh Institute was set up with an endowment from the Nirman Foundation. Can you hear me? No? Okay. The Parekh Institute was set up from an endowment by the Nirman Foundation. The Nirman Foundation was founded by Professor Parekh and his brother, and they were very kind enough to give us a small endowment to study the past and present moral, social and political thought of India, and to share its deliberations through workshops, conferences, lectures, and more importantly, intensive reading sessions. So we've had it going since 2015. In 2015, we invited 3 scholars, Professor Patrick Oliver, very well known, Professor Timothy Lubin, and Professor Marg. And the reading sessions we had were on the Manav Dharam Shastra, the Artha Shastra, and the Ashoka inscriptions. That was also the year when we had the inaugural C.R. Parekh Memorial Lecture. It was given by Professor Oliver. Next year, the following year, in 2016, we had 3 other scholars, Professor Larry McRae, Professor Ajay Rao, and Professor Christopher Minkowski. And that year we had a theme on exclusion and marginalization in ancient India, and the text we selected, there were certain sections from the text we selected were from Sabarabhashya, from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And that year's C.R. Parekh Memorial Lecture was given by Chris Minkowski. In 2017, we were lucky to have some funding from the Bruin Institute, so we could hold, apart from the reading sessions on ancient Indian and ancient Chinese thought, we also had a workshop on the ends of human life, and I'm happy to report that the volume based on the proceedings of the workshop will be out in a year or so. Most of the papers have come in. That will be the first publication of the Institute. The scholars who participated in that whole in the workshop and in the previous in the reading sessions were Professor David Wong, Professor Roger Ames, Professor Lee Cheng Young, Professor Daniel Bell, Professor Patrick Oliver, and Professor Donald Davis, and Professor Jean Schlitter. That year's memorial lecture was delivered by Professor David Wong. And last year we had reading sessions on certain South Indian performative texts in Sanskrit, and the reading sessions were led by Professor David Sulman, but among those who participated in that group were Professor Bronner, Yugal Bronner, Keshavan Velutat, Professor Gary Tubb, Andrew Olet, and we were also joined by Sudha Gopalakrishnan. And that year's C.R. Parekh Memorial Lecture was delivered by Yugal Bronner on Dandin's aesthetics. And this year we have had Professor Oliver, he's just brought out the Dharma Reader, which is a selection of texts from the early Dharma Sutras and the Dharma Shastras. And we had an absolutely wonderful session with him on the intellectual history of the idea of Dharma through those texts. And then we've had the wonderful, the great pleasure of having Professor Johannes Bronkhorst, who's here with us and whose works we are reading together and we are critically engaging with. So that's the report on the Institute. I'm delighted that we have Professor Bronkhorst deliver the 5th CRPI Memorial Lecture, and equally delighted that Professor Kunal Chakrabarti is chairing the session. Professor Chakrabarti is a former professor of ancient India at the Jawaharlal University. The most recent book that he's written, he's edited, is with Kanad Sinha on the Gupta period, on state power and legitimacy in the Gupta period. His work is well known for his other works, particularly the work published by Oxford University Press on religious processes and a dictionary of Bengali. Is that right? So I'll hand over the chair to the Chakrabarti.
The name of Professor Johannes Bronkhorst, the speaker today, needs no introduction to those who are even remotely familiar with the study of early Indian history, Indology, Sanskrit. But he is one of the foremost Indologists and Sanskrits of our time. But for those who may not be all that familiar with his work, a few words may be in order. Professor Bronkhorst was a professor at the University of Lausanne, from where he retired in 2011, and since then is an emeritus professor in the university. He was a professor of Sanskrit and Indian studies there. You will be interested to know that he started his academic career by studying physics and mathematics. And then he later became interested in Sanskrit, moved to India, and did his MA and PhD from University of Pune. Then, of course, he went back, he did another PhD from Leiden, and so on, and embarked on a very distinguished academic career. Professor Bronkhorst has worked on the history of Indian thought and published on a wide range of topics, including indigenous grammar and linguistics, the interaction between Brahmanism, Buddhism, and Jainism, and their philosophical schools and religious practices. A key output of this book, of his work, appeared in his monograph, Greater Magad, in 2007, which is a landmark volume according to me. Some of Professor Bronkhorst's publications address larger questions relating to the theory and study of religions. For example, a little while ago, while I was having an informal talk with Professor Bronkhorst, he told me that he is getting interested in the psychology of religion, and we all look forward to that. He has published more than 200 research articles and 19 books. Some of these books are, and some of them are pretty voluminous. So, some of these books are Rites without Symbols, Buddhism in the Shadow of Brahmanism, Language and Reality, Buddhist Teaching in India, How Brahmanism Won. Now, you can make out from some of his publications that he's primarily a scholar of Buddhism, but what interests most in my interest in his work is the interaction between Buddhism and Brahmanism. I think that this has been a mystery to all ancient Indian historians and students who want to study, is how from being the ideology of a handful of Brahmins, what has later been described as Brahmanism became an hegemonic ideology for most of India from the Gupta and post-Gupta times. This has puzzled me, I'm sure it has puzzled many. Professor Bronkhorst is one of the very few who has attempted to answer that question. Today he has chosen to speak on rethinking India's past. Nothing could be broader than that. Look forward. Professor Bronkhorst.
Thank you, Professor Chakrabarti, and thank you, Professor Bhargava, for your kind words and for having invited me to speak here. I'm delighted to be here. I enjoy the academic interaction which I get now every day until my departure. Most of the time I work rather much on my own, and it is only occasionally that I have occasion to discuss ideas, my ideas, other ideas, and to test them against the good sense of others. Tonight is one such occasion. I'm going to speak about some of the thoughts I've had over the years. I'm always ready to stand corrected if you can convince me that I've made a mistake, but let's first look at some of these ideas before we kind of reject them or criticize them. So, Brahmanism, as Professor Chakrabarti already mentioned, played a very important role in India. And one of the things it did, one of the things it left, is a certain vision of India's past. So the Brahmanical tradition has exerted a profound influence on India from an early time onward. This tradition, like all traditions, wherever we are in the world, had a certain vision of the past. It's almost part of the definition of tradition that it goes hand in hand with a vision of the past. And in the case of Brahmanism, the fact that it was so successful has given it ample opportunity to impose that vision. It had become a widely accepted vision, not only in India, but even on many scholars who work in and outside India on India's past. The task of the historian, here as elsewhere, is to verify the prevailing vision of the past and correct it where necessary. It's important always to distinguish between tradition and history. Tradition claims to know something about history, but the question whether that is true or not is the task of the historian to settle. One of the features of Brahmanism is that it has always presented itself as old and unchanging. Indeed, the claim was made, at least since the great grammarian Patanjali, who lived in the 2nd century before the Common Era, he made a claim that Sanskrit, which is the language of Brahmanism, was not just old, but beginningless. The same view came to be held with regard to the Veda, the literary corpus connected with Brahmanism. It said the Veda was not just old, but had no beginning. Inevitably, also Brahmanical civilization was thought of as tremendously old, and as the background of other cultural and religious movements in India. This view came to prevail and survive until today, not only in the general population, but still among many scholars. Buddhism in particular was thought of as a reaction against Brahmanism. It was taken for granted that when Buddhism arose, Brahmanism had been around for a very, very long time, also in the region where the Buddha preached. My researches over the years have convinced me that this vision of the past is not correct. It is true that Brahmanism had been around in the form of the Vedic tradition, had been around for a long time when Buddhism arose, but not in the region where the Buddha preached, nor in many other regions of India. Brahmanism is an ideology that in due time spread all over India and over much of Southeast Asia, but this spread had hardly begun at the time of the Buddha. And at that time, Brahmanism was largely centered in one region of the subcontinent. At the time of Patanjali, the grammarian whom I mentioned already, the term was used of a region called Aryavarta, that is the region where Orthodox Brahmins live. Now, Patanjali gives a rather precise description of the extent of Aryavarta, which shows that only part of the Ganges plain was included. Now, this was in the 2nd century before the Common Era, which is at least 2.5 centuries after the death of the Buddha. That means, at the time of the Buddha, Brahmanism was confined to a region which we cannot precisely determine, but within certain limits we can. 2.5 centuries after his death, still a Brahmanical author presents his view that Brahmanism does not even cover the whole of North India. That means the spread of Brahmanism had not yet been completed. Quite the contrary, it was just beginning. So Brahmanism then was a regional ideology, still during the last centuries preceding the Common Era. All this changed in subsequent centuries, but we do not know in detail just how, when, why, and where. We only know that the spread of Brahmanism owed nothing to conquering armies, as was the case with, for example, Islam. Nor was it imposed by an existing empire, as happened to Christianity during the days of the Roman Empire. It was not spread by religious missionaries. Indeed, the spread of Brahmanism had very little to do with religious conversion. No one converted to Brahmanism in the ordinary religious sense of the term. In fact, it is not very useful to think of Brahmanism as primarily a religion at all. Brahmanism was primarily a socio-political ideology with clear ideas as to the correct order of society and the correct way of running a state. In this ideology, the role of Brahmins was central. It is true, of course, I hear you already protesting, it is of course true that some of the activities that Brahmins engaged in, especially ritual activities, can rightly be considered religious. But accepting the elevated position of Brahmins in society, and making use of their ritual and other services did not require a change of belief. Numerous inscriptions testify to the fact that many Indian kings made use of these services without rejecting other movements, such as Buddhism and Jainism. On the religious level, Brahmanism was not, or barely, in competition with these alternative movements. We have the names of scholars who were Buddhists and Brahmins at the same time. At your famous Nalanda monastery, which you all have heard of because there's Nalanda University, it attracted many scholars also from abroad, and we have names of famous teachers there, and a number of those teachers who were Buddhists, who taught Buddhist philosophy, were designated as Brahmins. That means there was no felt opposition between the two. So we do not find in this information the slightest awareness of a contradiction. Socially, these scholars were Brahmins. Philosophically, they were Buddhists. Now, note that the reverse situation is not possible, and therefore is never recorded in our sources. One cannot be socially a Buddhist while at the same time a Brahmin by conviction. This, incidentally, is an asymmetry that historians of Indian philosophy rarely take into consideration. In the debates between Brahmins and Buddhists, Brahmins could be convinced by Buddhist arguments and yet remain Brahmins. Buddhists who were convinced by their Brahmanical opponents and by their arguments, on the other hand, did not become Brahmins, nor could they remain Buddhists. There is a subtle asymmetry which is rarely drawn attention to in all the many books that are written about Indian philosophy. The spread of Brahmanism, then, is a historical phenomenon that is, as yet, only little known and poorly understood. At the same time, it is a phenomenon of a vast scale that does not appear to have any parallel in world history. In as little as 6 or 7 centuries, a regional ideology that was more or less under threat, it appears, spread over the whole of the Indian subcontinent and into Southeast Asia, right up to Vietnam and the farther reaches of Indonesia. That is to say, an area as large as, if not larger than, the Roman Empire, and with presumably more inhabitants, underwent for a varying but substantial number of centuries the determining imprint of an ideology that had succeeded in imposing itself without the help of armies, without an imposing empire, and without religious conversion. Future research, I hope, will tell us more about how this could happen. All I can do here is draw attention to some specific developments. Consider first the use of Sanskrit. Sanskrit was the language of Brahmanism. Others did not use it. The oldest texts of Buddhism and Jainism used different forms of Middle Indic, languages different from Sanskrit. The oldest inscriptions in India are not in Sanskrit either. For some 400 years, inscriptions were made, but virtually none of them in Sanskrit. The reason is rather obvious. Sanskrit was the language of a regional ideology that is of Brahmanism, and that regional ideology so far exerted little influence, so no one felt called upon to use its language. All this changed around the 2nd century of the Common Era in northwestern India. All of a sudden, political inscriptions in Sanskrit make their appearance. What is more, the Buddhists of that part of the subcontinent change to Sanskrit. They already possessed an extensive literature in different languages, but decided there and then to translate much of that into Sanskrit. What had happened? It appears that the Brahmanical ideology had succeeded in gaining the upper hand in the political centers of northwestern India. Accepting the Brahmanical socio-political ideology implied using the language of Brahmanism, Sanskrit. The Buddhists of this region may initially not have accepted this ideology, but they did need the support of the royal court, and this, it appears, induced them to start using Sanskrit. The adoption of Sanskrit, both in political inscriptions and in Buddhist scriptures, implied far more than a mere change of language. It implied the adoption, at least in part, of the Brahmanical vision of society. Most of the early political inscriptions, which are not in Sanskrit, show no sign of being aware of the most fundamental Brahmanical social doctrine, namely that society is divided into Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. You'll look in vain in these early non-Sanskritic inscriptions for the words Brahmin, yes, the other three, no. Ashoka's famous edicts, for example, mention Brahmins on a number of occasions, most often together with Shramanas. But they never ever used the terms Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Clearly, society in his time and in most of his empire was not divided into these four so-called varnas, which I translate caste classes. The society that Ashoka was aware of, that he ruled over, was not divided into these four caste classes. These four caste classes are a Brahmanical superimposition, part of their social ideology, to which Ashoka did not feel beholden, and that he presumably was not even aware of. Brahmanism subsequently imposed this division of society wherever it could, not because society was really divided in this manner, but because Brahmanism maintained that it should. As a result, we find these four classes, caste classes, only mentioned in Brahmanical inscriptions. I pointed out above that Brahmanism, even where it innovated, maintained that nothing had changed, that the world had always been as it is. Brahmanism had always been there, and was the background for all other developments that had taken place. Brahmanism, seen this way, was the background from which Buddhism arose. My researchers have convinced me that this is not correct, historically speaking. Buddhism arose in a part of the Ganges plain that had not been Brahmanized, and that would remain outside the core area of Brahmanism for another 3 centuries at least. However, when Buddhism started using Sanskrit around the 2nd century of the Common Era, it adopted along with this language other Brahmanical notions. Buddhism came to think of itself as having arisen in Brahmanical surroundings. That, of course, doesn't help the historian. If the object of study itself makes claims, then the historian, is in a muddle, so to say, because the later text, the Sanskrit text of Buddhism, consider Buddhism itself as having arisen in Brahmanical surroundings. We see this most clearly if we contrast the accounts of the Buddha's life composed in Sanskrit with those composed in other languages, for example, Pali. Ashwagosha may have been one of the first Buddhists to write in Sanskrit. One of his works is called Life of the Buddha, Buddha Charita. And this work describes the life of the Buddha before his enlightenment. In its initial chapters, it speaks in most laudatory terms about the kingship of the Buddha's father, Shuddhodana. Kingship and society are here presented as pervaded by Brahmanical ideas and customs. Not only does his kingly father receive Brahmins to pronounce on the future greatness of his newborn son, Shuddhodana has the birth ceremony, Jata Karman, carried out and performs Vedic murmurings, Japa. He performs oblations, Homa, and auspicious rites to celebrate the event. All this is followed by a gift of 100,000 cows to Brahmins. Later in the story, he pours oblations into the fire and gives golden cows to Brahmins, this time to ensure a long life for his son. He drinks soma as enjoined by the Vedas. He performs sacrifices, even though the text adds only non-violent sacrifices. He has a purohita, which means a Brahmanical court priest, who is described as being in charge of the sacrifices. In other words, the father of the Buddha, according to Ashwagosha, is as Brahmanical as you can get. He fits the stereotype, he fits the descriptions and prescriptions, whereas in the lives of the Buddha, the descriptions of the early life of the Buddha, in other languages, nothing of the kind can be found. In other words, a strong Brahmanization has taken place and taken its place in the vision Buddhism started cultivating of its own past. So Brahmanical elements show up in other chapters as well. When King Shrenya of Magadha, one of the kings that the Buddha is meant to have met before he was enlightened, when he still was a bodhisattva. So this king, King Shrenya, gives friendly advice to the bodhisattva, that is to the future Buddha. And what does he counsel him to do? He must pursue the triple end of life, Trevarga, which is, you know it all, Kama, Artha, and Dharma. But this is a completely Brahmanical concept, the Trivarga. But that doesn't prevent the king Shrenya to advise the future Buddha to pursue these three ends of life. King Shrenya further points out that performing sacrifices is his kula dharma, his family obligation. Again, a very Brahmanical concept. Mara, the Buddha's arch enemy, who tries to prevent him from attaining liberation, calls upon him to follow his swadharma, again a term which you know as belonging very much to the Brahmanical tradition. These and other examples show not just that Ashwagosha was familiar with Brahmanism, this has been known to scholars for a long time, but that he and his readers situated the Buddha in Brahmanized surroundings. So we see here the change from the earlier period in which this was not the case, this was not the way Buddhism thought of itself, and here with the adoption of Sanskrit we find a rather invasive Brahmanization which changes the perspective altogether. Our reflections so far show that the process of Brahmanization was both subtle and profound. Buddhism did not disappear in the early centuries CE. It was not replaced by Brahmanism, quite the contrary. It was going to flourish in India for many centuries to come. And yet, It had changed the way it perceived itself. Perhaps this is a general feature of Brahmanization. It does not necessarily replace other movements and worldviews, but it affects them from within. How did Brahmanism succeed in exerting such a profound effect on other worldviews and ideologies? I pointed out already that Brahmanism did not spread through armies, imperial imposition, or religious conversion. The question of Brahmanism's success requires more study, but some observations can already be made, and I will make them now. We start from the observation that Brahmanism, though it may not have had an army or an empire of its own, it was no stranger to political power. Indeed, one of the mechanisms of its spread, probably the most important one, passed through the various royal courts in South and Southeast Asia. Inscriptions in both these areas mention kings who invite Brahmins to their court, sometimes from afar. Once established at the royal courts, Brahmanical influence could filter down, helped by royal largesse. The comparison with Christianity can yield some further insight. We have to be very careful with comparisons, and we certainly should not make any identifications, but they may give some ideas. The conversion of Emperor Constantine imposed Christianity upon the Roman Empire. Brahmanism too was introduced from above, but not in one single empire. Brahmanism passed through numerous kingdoms of relatively limited size. And there is a further difference. Constantine, the Roman emperor, personally converted to Christianity, or at least he pretended that he did. But no king needed to convert to Brahmanism. Brahmanism is quite simply not the kind of thing you can convert to. As I said earlier, calling it a religion is stretching the meaning of this term. And I prefer to call it, as I said earlier, a socio-political ideology with a variable religious dimension. Central to Brahmanism is the vision of society, in which Brahmins occupy a preeminent position. This vision covers ideas as to how society is or should be organized, about rituals that may be performed, and much else, but deities play a marginal role. Some of the most orthodox, or perhaps I should say orthoprax, Brahmins were or could be atheists. There was place for atheists in Brahmanism. You didn't have to believe any god whatsoever, and if you wanted to, you had a choice. And we find examples of that in early Mimamsa, which has no place for divinities, and even the school of the Lokayatas or Charvakas, which, contrary to what some people claim, I look upon as a Brahmanical school of thought. What Brahmins expected from others is that they accepted their superiority and their vision of society. In principle, there was no expectation that people change their mode of worship. Indeed, one might combine sympathies for Brahmanism and, say, Buddhism. Inscriptions confirm that certain rulers had such combined sympathies. So if kings did not convert to Brahmanism, why did they bother to invite Brahmins and promote their vision of society? Why should they accept the claim that Brahmins are superior to everyone else, including the king himself? What was going on? What was the attraction of this particular movement, of this ideology? The problem that confronts historians of early India is that most of our information is profoundly one-sided. Most early literature is Sanskrit literature, and most Sanskrit literature is Brahmanical literature. As such, it will give us little information about what went on in the heads of rulers, for example. Most of the remaining literature that is not Brahmanical literature belongs to Buddhism and Jainism, and that does not help us much either in this respect, especially since these religions became profoundly Brahmanized themselves. The only textual sources that present us, usually indirectly, with the point of view of rulers who supported Brahmins, are inscriptions. Many inscriptions concern gifts to Brahmins, usually in the shape of so-called agraharas, tax-free land for the benefit, often, usually, of Brahmins. Tax-free land that is frequently already inhabited by people who were expected to provide the Brahmins with what they needed. Such gifts were meant to provide a reliable source of support to Brahmins for the pursuit of their sacral responsibilities. Once again, we still have a question. What were such gifts expected to bring the donor? Why should a king bother giving away part of his land to be used by others? A theme that often recurs in the inscriptions is increase of merit. So the king does this very meritorious deed so that the merit may accrue either to himself or to a family member, to someone who has died, and so on. But to some extent this begs the question, why should a ruler wish to obtain the kind of merit that Brahmanism promised? They hoped for a better afterlife, to be sure, but clearly they had to believe first that gifts to Brahmins were the way to attain it. As usual with claims about the afterlife, there was no way to verify their efficacy. We may assume that rulers expected also more visible results from their largesse, such as magical protection of their kingdom and kingship. But even such practical expectations were and had to be built on a reputation that preceded the Brahmins. So I talk about the spread of Brahmanism, I talk about potential donors who, are not yet in the sphere of influence of Brahmanism, but who then, as we know from inscriptions, invite Brahmins to come. Somehow, the reputation of Brahmins, in many cases, must have preceded their physical movement. Somehow, it should be known, in inverted commas, to the rulers, that the presence and support of Brahmins was good for a kingdom before a ruler would get involved with them. So how did Brahmins succeed in building such a reputation for themselves? Now the details of this process will probably forever remain unknown. We may surmise that pure chance played a role, followed after initial successes by a snowball effect. The early Buddhist texts tell us that there were Brahmins traveling beyond their core area who promoted their vision of society to whoever was ready to listen to them. Most of the discussions of Brahmins with the Buddha, if the texts of the Buddhist canon are to be believed, turned around the superiority of Brahmins. These Brahmins combined their missionary activity, missionary in the sense that they wanted to convince others that they were better, superior to others. So these Brahmins combined this missionary activity with certain services they provided to the population. The sages who predicted the future of the newly born Bodhisattva, of the Buddha when he was born, they were Brahmins. So obviously that was one of the services these people rendered. They could read the signs, they could read the stars, and predict the future. Also, other services involving access to higher knowledge and higher powers were no doubt part of their arsenal. Brahmanical access to higher powers was clearly an attribute that would interest many, including rulers. It is also an attribute that is given much emphasis in stories that Brahmins succeeded in bringing into circulation and in which they play important roles. Many of these stories were or became part of the Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These are epics about warriors and fighting, but one cannot read them without being struck by the powerful Brahmanical figures that play prominent roles in them without participating in the fighting. Stories that illustrate this Brahmanical power are numerous. My favorite one occurs in the Ramayana and tells how the Brahmanical sage Bharadvaja entertains King Bharata, the brother of Rama, and his army. King Bharata arrives with his army at the ashrama, at the hermitage of the sage Bharadvaja. To cut a long story short, Bharadvaja invokes the help of a number of gods and offers the soldiers the best meal they ever ate, including meat and alcoholic drinks. Following that, there are pleasures for all the senses, including music, and, last but not least, beautiful damsels, 15 for each soldier. Not surprisingly, the soldiers have the time of their life and express their intention never to return to the capital, nor to move on, saying, "This is heaven." Bharata only gets his army back because Bharadvaja's hospitality comes to an end the next day. But we see who has the real power here. Bharadvaja is in a position to take away Bharata's army without any fight or confrontation. There are numerous other stories in the Sanskrit epics and elsewhere that emphasize Brahmanical power. Presumably, such stories spread and were appreciated, creating in many the conviction that one should not cross Brahmins, and that it was always better to have them on one side. This would be a good reason for rulers to support Brahmins, and if there were none around, to invite them to come to their kingdom. Brahmanism, as it presented itself, was not a new phenomenon and had never been. Brahmanical literature is at pains to point out that it had been around for a long time, sometimes indeed from beginningless time. The main events of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are situated in an imprecise but remote past. Quite apart from the main story, the Mahabharata reminds its readers, on several occasions, and its listeners, it reminds them of the fact that a Brahmin, known by the name Parashurama, had killed off all warriors, that means all kings, 3 times 7 times over, because they had misbehaved. Clearly, Brahmanical power was already superior to royal power in the remote past, and it was in the interest of all to maintain good relations. We wouldn't like another Parashurama to show up and kill them all off. Brahmins therefore pose a threat, but they can also be of great help. Once again, history as presented by the Brahmins can illustrate this. The great Maurya Empire, that to the modern historian looks like something that had been pretty much like a disaster for Brahmanism, because the Maurya Empire was centered in the east, in the region where Buddhism and Jainism had arisen, and where Brahmanism was not predominant. So the rulers in Pataliputra were not particularly interested in promoting and supporting Brahmanism. But subsequent history, or the view that Brahmanism then proposes of the Maurya Empire with hindsight, is that it was really a Brahmanical creation. The founder of this empire, Chandragupta, had succeeded in creating this empire supposedly by following the advice of his Brahmanical counselor, Chanakya. What is more, this same Chanakya, who had as much as created the Maurya Empire, was also thought of as the author of the classical Sanskrit text on statecraft, the Artha Shastra. All the wisdom united in this work was at the disposition of rulers who were ready to appoint a Brahmin as chief advisor. But of course, none of these claims are confirmed by modern scholarship. That means Chanakya, the story of Chanakya, turns out to be a rather late invention, and all the efforts made to date the Arthashastra show that this text was composed quite a number of centuries after the time of Chandragupta. I may even add the minor point: to the best of our knowledge, at the time of Chandragupta, few people knew how to write. Writing was not around. So, which makes it all the less plausible that someone wrote the Arthashastra while he was king. Now, if it slowly becomes clear what risks can be avoided and what advantages gained by pleasing Brahmins, there is one other factor that must have played a role in their extraordinary success. At least in theory, Brahmanical advisors do not aspire to kingship. Brahmins are therefore not only the most competent and most powerful advisors, they are also safe, at least believed to be safe, in the sense that they will not try to replace the king they advise. Our reflections so far explain more or less why a king might wish to be assisted by Brahmanical advisors. It does not yet explain why he would reward Brahmins with agraharas, with sources of steady income away from the capital. Clearly, agraharas were often rewards for services rendered, but not only that. Many agraharas, as it appears from the inscriptions, were given to Brahmins who were not involved in running the state, but who excelled in this or that aspect of traditional Brahmanical learning. The recipients of agraharas were supposed to live lives dedicated to ritual practice and Brahmanical learning, following in a way the example of the Brahmanical sages in their hermitages, ashramas, that are depicted in the epics and elsewhere. This, as we have seen, was deemed to increase the merit of the donor or of those close to him. We may conjecture that kings somehow felt they could harness Brahmanical power in this way, even though I'm not aware of any text that explicitly put it this way. It appears then that Brahmins often came to be asked by local rulers to settle in their kingdoms, and in such cases they were most typically provided with the usufruct of a village and land, which allowed them to concentrate on other matters. These other matters would normally involve performing rituals, reciting their holy texts, that is the Veda, teaching their shastras, their sciences, and other such things. The underlying supposition was that the presence of a ritually active community of Brahmins would be advantageous for the kingdom. Some Brahmins, moreover, would play a role at the royal court as advisors in both ritual and political matters. There is another reason why rulers may have been keen to have Brahmins at their courts. We know that the political history of South and Southeast Asia during the first millennium of the Common Era saw the rise and decline of numerous regional kingdoms. Inscriptions report ad nauseam the military feats of rulers who conquered and destroyed each other's territories without restraint. Assuming that these inscriptions are to at least some extent reliable, the military competence of many of these rulers left little to be desired. But more is required than mere military competence for acquiring and maintaining a kingdom. What these rulers needed, once they had won their battles, was practical advice as to how to run their kingdom and how to protect it against unforeseen dangers. Brahmins were specialized in these two realms. Their undisturbed ritual occupations provided the best supernatural protection imaginable, and they combined that with theoretical competence in matters of polity. It is interesting to compare these Brahmanical skills with those that Buddhists had on offer. Buddhism had begun as a religion of people who had left society and who had therefore very little to say about how society should be run. They left it behind. Whatever they left behind was not their concern. They were now outside it. It is true that Buddhism did not remain for long a movement exclusively of renouncers. It may still have been like that during the realm of Ashoka, but there are clear indications from northern India that this changed during the last centuries before the Common Era. Buddhism at that time came into the possession of monasteries and much else, and this is no doubt a reason why it came to depend ever more on the active support of political rulers. They had to maintain monasteries, they had something to look after, and to build buildings, whatever. We have already seen one of the consequences of this new dependence. Buddhism came to adopt the language of the Brahmins, Sanskrit, because like the Brahmins, it sought access to the centers of political power. Buddhism then needed the support of political rulers. What could it offer in return? The Brahmins could offer a lot, enough to convince many rulers that they could not risk not to support Brahmins. How about Buddhists? It appears that the Buddhists had a hard time competing with the Brahmins at the royal courts, and that this became, in the long run, one of the reasons why Buddhism did not survive in India. Brahmanism offered, apart from supernatural protection, lots of practical advice to rulers, how to organize society, how to run their kingdom, etc., etc. Buddhism, still during the early centuries of the Common Era, offered nothing of the kind. As stated earlier, Buddhism had no vision of society and of how it should be run. True, there are a number of Buddhist texts that proffer advice to rulers from those early centuries. But close inspection only shows how useless this advice is. Kings should give money to the poor and avoid violence. Now, this is hardly the advice that will secure that a king will stay in charge for long in the ruthless environment of incessantly competing kingdoms characteristic of India during those centuries. Some of these Buddhist authors admit, though implicitly, that their advice is totally unrealistic by recommending kings to become rather monks. Stop being king, become a monk. With regard to the ritual protection offered by Buddhism to rulers, we can be brief. During the early centuries of the Common Era, they offered next to nothing of the kind. An inspection of the sources has led me to conclude that for a long time, say during the first 5 centuries of the Common Era, Buddhism left many of the skills that might be useful for rulers to Brahmins. We saw that Buddhism came to adopt a semi-Brahmanical vision of society. We talked about it earlier. This implied that certain activities were left to Brahmins. These included, of course, ritual activities, political counseling, but lots of other activities as well. Among these, predicting the future on the basis of various indications and astrology. One of the surprising consequences, which surprised me when I discovered it, of this is that there are practically no surviving names of Buddhists who engaged in astronomy and mathematics during that period. This in spite of the fact that Buddhists were active in other sciences. They had a rich intellectual culture, but apparently they did not engage in astronomy and mathematics. Whereas at the same time, there's a number of Brahmanical authors, there's a number of Jaina authors known, no Buddhist authors. Astronomy and mathematics in the Indian context were inseparable from astrology. And astrology was the domain of Brahmins, not of Buddhists. In short, for a number of centuries, Buddhism in India did not intrude into the realms of activity that the Brahmins considered their own. By the time they tried to change this with the advent of Tantrism, it was too late. Buddhism had not been able to compete credibly with Brahmanism, and its decline may be looked upon as its almost inevitable consequence. Contrary to Buddhism, Brahmanism offered advantages that rulers could scarcely do without. This was not the result of historical coincidence. It can be argued that at least to some extent, Brahmanism during the last centuries preceding the Common Era had prepared the ground, that it had developed the tools and methods which in due time turned out to be very efficacious. It is possible to look upon the Brahmanical literature composed during the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era as playing a role in the project that Brahmanism was entering upon. This literature shows that the Brahmins of that period had two major concerns. On the one hand, they were concerned to create a separate identity for themselves. Brahmins are expected to follow a lifestyle that is different from all others. Purity plays a central role in it and finds expression in the observance of numerous rituals and sacraments. Through this Brahmin's purity of descent, both on the paternal and maternal side, and through the distance maintained from persons and things that are considered polluting. This concern finds expression in those texts that were primarily meant for internal consumption. Among them various texts on dharma and ritual. I talk primarily about the Dharma Sutras and the Grihya Sutras. Dharma Sutras are composed by Brahmins and primarily for Brahmins. They really not aim at a wider public, unlike, say, a text like the Mahabharata, which obviously aims at reaching a wider audience. And the Grihya Sutra is the same thing. It prescribes how Brahmins are supposed to perform their private rituals, primarily. Besides this, there are Brahmanical texts from this period that concentrate on the image that Brahmins were concerned to project onto society at large. And here I include texts like the Mahabharata, which project an image of Brahmins as sometimes wise, sometimes unpredictable, but always powerful and scary. Brahmins like to live in peace in their hermitages and may seem in this way inoffensive. But numerous stories remind us that they can be deadly if crossed. Political advice is given much attention, as are indications how to fit into the social hierarchy that is the hallmark of Brahmanism. It would be worth a detailed study to analyze the model of Brahmanism that arose during the crucial centuries around the beginning of the Common Era. I've already put some effort in this direction in one of my more recent books. This model referred back, at least in part, to the Vedic tradition, but other aspects were quite new. But even new notions, such as the idea of the Brahmanical hermitage, ashrama, an idea that's completely absent from Vedic literature, were presented as old, as having been in existence from time immemorial. This model was to become surprisingly successful in subsequent centuries. Well, further analysis of this should certainly be done, and I do hope that historians and other scholars will join me in trying to deal with a number of detailed questions that remain after the few things I have said. But I'll conclude with something which we don't. So far I've talked about what I find in texts, including inscriptions. I now will bring in something that has nothing to do primarily with texts, but that sheds very interesting light on what I've been saying so far. There is some independent evidence showing the profound influence that Brahmanism exerted on Indian society. I had occasion to mention its emphasis on purity of descent. Strict rules applied not only to Brahmins, but also to other groups in society. Numerous texts warn that not abiding by these rules has dire consequences, in that offspring will not be accepted in the social groups to which their parents belong. Now, these warnings, they had their effects, which can now be shown up by genetic research. And I quote from an article that came out rather recently in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science in America. And I quote from it that genetic research shows that the practice of endogamy was established almost simultaneously, possibly by degree of the rulers, in upper caste populations of all geographical regions of northern India, about 70 generations before the present, probably during the reign of the Gupta rulers. This I quote literally. Their research can show that there is a strong, the change takes place 70 generations ago, whereas before people intermarried rather freely. From that date onward, there is a strong tendency to marry only within the own group. And 70 generations, of course, we don't know exactly how long ago that is. This particular author, Mr. Basu, and his collaborators think that may correspond roughly to the Gupta period. It may be a bit before, perhaps a bit later. It doesn't matter. It is kind of like a striking confirmation of an imposition of a Brahmanical vision and Brahmanical requirements on not only on Brahmins themselves, but on society at large. So there are other studies which I don't quote here, they seem to confirm this. So it seems safe to conclude that a shift to endogamy took place during the first half of the first millennium of the Common Era in northern India. We are permitted to assume that the growing influence of Brahmanism played a role in this. I thank you for your attention.